Hello, everyone in person. Hello, everyone online. Thanks for joining today. Happy to have you. My name is Colin Black. I'm a privacy and cybersecurity attorney at the law firm Wilson Sonsini. I happen to sit in Chicago, where I'm licensed as an attorney. But we work with clients all over the United States, all over the world. And the primary sort of scope of my practice is incident response. I'm a leading member of the incident response team, and really what that translates to in practice is I'm sort of the lawyer when something goes bad with cybersecurity flavor. That can be anything from sort of a small sort of, oops, the records were left out, right? And they were shown to someone maybe that they should not have been. Other times it is a ransomware attack that's affecting, a major company, causing global outages, hospitals, I mean, you name it, we've seen it. We do a little bit of everything if it involves data. And in a lot of ways, it is a hybrid role, right? It is very much sort of advising on the law, providing legal opinion on how to handle a given cybersecurity incident. But in parallel, it's also, wearing a digital forensics hat at times, sort of questioning the validity of artifacts, bolstering the validity of artifacts when we can. It involves regulatory response work, working with law enforcement, working against law enforcement in the case of something like a subpoena. It is anything and everything cybersecurity. And so, with that lens, wanted to sort of give a 101 level, no prior knowledge assumed sort of overview of what are we talking about? Why are lawyers talking about cybersecurity to begin with, right? We'll jump ahead a little bit, but the answer is it's affecting businesses, right? And businesses impact lawyers. They tell us where our legal services are needed in a lot of cases. And so, because it is an area of business risk and lawyers are typically involved in the management of risk, that's a lot of what we're doing here. We'll go through a few introductory comments, and then I think it's important to spend a little bit of time sort of getting everyone, from 0 to 1 on cybersecurity, right? What are we talking about? Let's get a baseline level of familiarity with technology. This is not a CDM course, right? But we are going to touch on some of the key concepts. What are sort of the lens that we should be applying? The reality here is that any sort of technologies that I go into today, the implementations of those technologies change over time, right? The underlying idea of, say, something like encryption or wireless technology. I mean, this stuff has been around for a couple hundred years now in a lot of ways, right? If you're talking about encryption, you can go back to the Caesar cipher or before, right? There are, there's a whole historical body here. Really, what changes is the implementation. And so I don't think it's terribly valuable to spend a lot of time talking about, AES 256 and why that's the best encryption standard to use right now, because in 10 years, it may not be. Right. We've got quantum computing on the horizon. We've got AI, and we've got all these other sort of things that are on the horizon that we are looking at and sort of trying to retrofit existing law around, but also sort of adjust these implementations in such a way that they make sense. One thing that I will note is, cybersecurity in a lot of ways can be sort of a conversation about risk mitigation. And, in the same way that there is there's no such thing as zero risk, right? There's always a little. There's no such thing as perfect security, right? There's no such thing as something that is unhackable. It's really more about a balancing of effort, a balancing of risk, and an assessment of risk. So we're going to sort of level set on those cybersecurity concepts. We're going to talk about the risks. And then, I think it would be helpful to talk about some very general risk mitigation ideas, right? These are things that both as lawyers, we can be applying to ourselves, right, on behalf of our clients, but also for our clients, right? This is an area of risk, right? The SEC in particular has become particularly sort of aggressive in this area, talking about sort of cybersecurity regulations and what kinds of statements can be made. Now, interestingly, and we'll talk a little bit more about the SEC in just a little bit, in a lot of ways, it is sort of what do we think the law should be is sort of the lens that is applied at times. There are oftentimes, doctrines that we would learn even here in law school that, ultimately don't quite extend in the same way that you might expect in the cybersecurity context, right? So, If we're talking about personal jurisdiction, for example, you know, everyone in civil procedure, right, is thinking our international shoe minimum contacts analysis, right? And we're talking about where we do business and where's our nerve center, you know, these sorts of tests. But in cybersecurity land, right, I mean, you know, you might have a business that solely does business in Texas, right, or solely does business in California, but is subject to a regulatory inquiry in Indiana because they ran afoul of an Indiana regulation, right? And that's counterintuitive. But the sort of bottom line for lawyers is that that is a risk that you will face, your clients will face. You know, most people have in some way been hacked and probably will be again in the near future. And so, you know, thinking through exactly sort of how we're going to handle that risk and thinking about the risks that are actually sort of out there. Finally, we'll talk about some key sort of considerations that are unique to lawyers, you know, sort of an ethics flavor. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those ethics rules and the key ABA opinions. My goal here today is not that you leave with the understanding of, you know, exactly sort of all the nuances in these opinions, but rather that you acknowledge they exist. You understand that they do apply to any attorneys, any practicing attorneys, and, you know, sort of being able to spot those key sort of points. Finally, you know, I do want to leave some time for Q&A, but, you know, I view this presentation as, you know, a conversation in a lot of ways. Like I can ramble about risk, right? And that's, we can talk about code and risk and firewall configurations, and I'm happy to do that. Those are fun. Probably more fun for me than you. So, you know, if you have questions, you know, if there are things that you'd like to expand on, please let me know. Happy to talk through those and, you know, sort of take it where it makes sense. So cybersecurity and IT basics, right? We're getting from sort of no prior knowledge. And so I think it's helpful to start with this image. And, you know, I think maybe from the heading of the presentation today, you might have a sense of what this is, but, you know, any guesses from the room on what is this mess of dots, right? What are we looking at here? In practice, these are sort of if you were to diagram the internet by connecting nodes, you were to say, you know, this small dot here is connected to all of these other ones through these networks and these connections and these protocols, and it forms this web. And, you know, I think while this is somewhat dated, you know, it does give sort of a good sort of background here. If you are this dot over here, how anonymous are you really online? You know, you're anonymous in the sense that there are many other dots around you, right? It's challenging to pick out the particular dot. But when you start talking about things like privacy, right? If I told you that was your social security number, right? We might feel a little bit more uncomfortable with being that dot on the screen. And so, you know, as we look at this, it's all these sort of interconnected nodes on a single web, right? And that's kind of the idea here. When you link up your computer to a network, your network is one of these dots, and that network goes to the ISP. The ISP sort of broadcasts it to the wider world. You're all connected, right? And every sort of device, every IoT device, it's all connected, it's all assigned, you know, and so securing something on this kind of a web from prying eyes is not, it's not easy, right? It's one of those things where I think in a lot of ways you need to temper expectations, even sort of being, you know, as offline as possible, right? We're still talking about things like cell towers, right? And you can always sort of be somewhere on this web. And so, you know, we don't want to rely on the fact that, you know, the green padlock is in the corner of our browser, right? Or we don't want to rely on, well, I'm not signed in. Right. These are the kinds of things that, you know, maybe 30 years ago might have been meaningful, but today truly aren't. So what observations can we make from that map? And as I've referenced, you know, one is that in a lot of ways, any information that is put on that web, anything that is uploaded is broadcasted, right? You can think about this in like traditional like AM FM radio, right? If you sort of broadcast on your frequency, anybody on that frequency can sort of pick that up. And while it's a slightly different flavor today, in a lot of ways, it's still the same kind of idea. If it's online, it can be picked up. And so there's a question about that, what's sort of the contents of the data that we're putting up? What makes something secure versus insecure, right? And this is, I think, where most people kind of fall off on the tech side. We're comfortable with the idea that, everything is sort of online and connected, and we sort of have a sense of what that means. And I think maybe, a lot of lawyers could tell you, well, it's zeros and ones, and that's somehow meaningful. As always, right, in computer science, we go to Alice and Bob, right, A to B. We're talking about transmission, wireless sending of data, sometimes over wire, but generally speaking, we're talking about data transmission. And the flow is generally from a sender to a receiver, right, and there are different sort of formats of that. But at its core, it's zeros and ones. What do we mean by zeros and ones? Computers think in binary. And so a 0 is off, a 1 is on. And so you can look at individual transistors and clusters of transistors and sort of scale that up into something that the computer can understand. These are instructions. And so that is binary code. That's sort of how that works at its core. Now, one of the things that I think is easy to sort of lose sight of is if we're talking about zeros and ones, if we're talking about code, if we're talking about, say, a cookie, which if you ever open up your text file on your browser, you'll see it's like 64 characters and it's not terribly interesting. It's just sort of a long string. If we're talking about an advertising ID, very much the same kind of idea. It's just a long string that sort of represents you. It's easy to sort of lose track of that as something that is sensitive. And so we might say, well, why do we care, right? Why would it matter if someone intercepts the zeros and ones? And, I think when you put up something like, the movie Hackers or whatever, right? It's all these sort of, or the Matrix, it's just all these sort of abstract characters flowing down the screen. And we don't really know what a lot of that means. But we think, if it doesn't make sense to us, it must not be terribly sensitive. And so in a lot of ways, that's kind of how lawyers tend to think about it. And so in the Alice and Bob example, right, we can make one small change. We might say instead of Alice to Bob, it's you to your bank, right? And we're going to send some information. And instead of zeros and ones, we're going to sort of take that layer of abstraction up one level. So in other words, we're going to aggregate those zeros and ones and sort of translate them into something that is slightly more human readable. And it might say something like this, right? And so we're going to send user ID equals string colon B, comma, password equals string, password 1, to bank. And this is where we start seeing problems, right? Because now you're talking about data that is visible, readable to humans. But I think it wouldn't take someone terribly creative to figure out how something like this could be misused. So the zeros and ones mean something. What is the relationship to cybersecurity, right? What is the relationship between information, privacy, cybersecurity? Where does one start and the other stop? A lot of times, I think privacy is still sort of a developing space in a lot of ways. And so, the idea of privacy, cybersecurity, information governance, all the flavors, all the hats you can wear, there's a lot of sort of conflating between them. So just for purposes of this discussion, cybersecurity is going to be how we protect information, right? Privacy, it tends to be a little bit more related on personal information and sort of how that relates to individuals. But here we're talking about how we protect information. That raises kind of a scoping question, certainly to the lawyers in the room, right? What exactly are we protecting from, right? If maybe you've got a sort of a distant family member who tends to post conspiracy theories on the internet, right? And maybe their employer finds it and that gets them canned from their job, right? Is that a cybersecurity failing because we've had a data mishap? Not necessarily, right? I mean, it was really more of a sort of disclosure problem. But we're thinking more about what are we protecting from? And cybersecurity tends to apply sort of a trifecta, right? We've got these 3 pillars, things that we care about. And this is the lens that I want you to apply as we think through what is a cyber issue, right? What's a cybersecurity problem? Keep going back to this lens. There are 3 pillars that we talk about, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability. These are sort of the universal three. You will see other, sort of other academics sort of reframe or maybe add additional ones. I know non-repudiation is one that's talked about here quite a bit. Authentication is another one. But we'll walk through these. We'll stick to the core three. Certainly if anyone has questions about those others, we can talk about them. But when we're thinking about confidentiality, right, we're talking about the prevention of unauthorized disclosure of information. Now, importantly, right, this does not mean publication, right? Confidentiality means if it is viewed by someone who was not supposed to be viewing it, that's a confidentiality failure, full stop. So maybe that is HR records, right, at a smaller business, and someone who should not be working with HR records pulls them up, right? That's a confidentiality failure. It's a cybersecurity issue. This is data that's accessed, by really anyone who isn't authorized to begin with. So that's what we're talking about with confidentiality. Integrity is the idea that the data that is sent should be the data that is received, right? And we can talk about things like website defacement, right? You intended to have the website say something in particular, and after it was hacked, it now says something else. That's an integrity issue. But it also, for more sort of core type applications, right? What if your financial account number was 1 digit off, right? What if your credit card had 1 digit changed? That fundamentally sort of ruins the application. Health information, if the vial with your blood type or your file with your blood type on it is mislabeled, that could be problematic in some ways, right? And that's an integrity problem. So we're thinking about data confidentiality. Who can sort of see this data? Integrity is the data sort of what we think it should be. And finally, availability. This is the idea that information should be available when it is needed. I think most sort of low-hanging fruit example, right? It's something like a denial of service attack. If you flood a website with enough traffic that the server can't distinguish between automated and legitimate traffic, it will stop responding to the legitimate traffic. It'll just be sort of too bogged down. There are flavors of this where, maybe it's not the volume of requests, but maybe it's something like a single request. And the request is, hey, server, just hold on a second, I'll be ready for you in just a moment. And the server might do it, right? And that would be an availability issue. The other availability issue that we see often, and this is, what keeps the lights on, in my world, is ransomware, right? The ransomware at its core is the use of a technology like encryption illegitimately, to cause disruptions in availability. Sometimes that can be something as simple as, maybe a database of assets for the website doesn't load quite right, and it just doesn't quite work. But the core sort of functionality is the same. Other times it's the firmware on a life support machine at a hospital, right? And it's really a very huge problem when we see everything sort of locked up. Availability, ransomware is an attack on availability. As a side note on that, we're also seeing threat actors do something that we're calling double extortion. It's really, they sort of blend in the confidentiality component. So what they might do is they might steal your data first and threaten to publish it before they lock you up. And so the idea here is if a company has the ability to recover from backups, right, we'll certainly try to make sure that they can't if we're the threat actors. But irrespective, maybe they do have a backup that is viable. We still want to get paid. And so we're going to attack confidentiality and availability. But interestingly, there's really not much of a data integrity problem other than, as long as it can be decrypted, I suppose. It's really not too much of an integrity issue. So we now have this framework, right, where we're thinking about data confidentiality, integrity, availability. We know cybersecurity is sort of how we protect these things, right? That's the lens that we're applying. Now we can start to get to the little bit more fun part and talk about, what does some of this risk actually mean? What does this translate to in real life? And so, I think to the extent that there are, trained actuaries in the presentation here in the room online, we could probably sort of quibble about the definition of risk, and maybe mine's not terribly comprehensive. But I think in a nutshell, right, when I am working with clients on sort of risk mitigation, really thinking about three things. We're thinking about the probability of something happening. How likely is it that this bad thing will happen? We're talking about the harm. How bad will it be if the bad thing does happen, right? And risk tolerance. How willing are you to take that chance? Everybody will have a different risk appetite. And so let's talk about something like, like COVID. Let's take COVID, for example. COVID in a lot of ways was very disruptive. I don't think a lot of people had global pandemic on their bingo cards in 2018, 2019. That wasn't there. And so we might have said it's a very low probability thing, right? Again, it wasn't on our bingo card. However, the harm is potentially significant, right? In the event of a global pandemic, it could be pretty disruptive in a lot of ways. And so, the lens that we're thinking about here is how bad will it be? And finally, how willing are you to take the chance that the bad thing happens? For example, maybe you're a company that says, well, we don't know every sort of terrible thing that could potentially happen. But, generally speaking, we know that there are types of events that can occur in the world that will disrupt our ability to be in the office or be in person. And so we want to invest in enough sort of technical infrastructure that we can have employees have the ability to work remotely. If something does happen, all we need to do is scale up our VPN licenses and we're good to go. Other companies might say that there's substantially no likelihood of something like that happening. There's no reason to really do anything here. The important part in either case is that as a company and as a lawyer, you have thought about these risks, you've advised your client on these risks, and you've sort of thought through what that might look like and how you might address them. So in my practice, we see everything under the sun, but I think there are some recurring sort of sources, right? There are some recurring themes here, things that we see a lot. The example password one with an exclamation point, if that's ever been your password, if that is your password, please change it. I put it up on the screen. Please don't let that be your password. It shouldn't be, summer 2024 or the name of your law firm with an exclamation point. These are all things that shouldn't happen. But we do have some overarching themes here. One is this idea of access without authorization, right? And this is the most vanilla sort of hacker type scenario you can imagine. Maybe you've got a company or you're working with a client, you've got sort of a fixed list of digital assets, and somebody accesses them. You've got a confidentiality issue. Maybe they choose to attack the integrity, right? They change the records, they change their grade in the school system. Maybe it's an availability issue where they deploy something like ransomware. But no matter what, you're talking here about somebody who is accessing the system that had no basic right to be there in the first place. By contrast, you've got someone who exceeds the scope of their authorization. Here, I think the classic example is someone who, maybe takes someone like a police officer who utilizes the law enforcement resources to, for sort of personal use, right? Maybe they do some digging on, a personal friend or something like that. Maybe they use law enforcement resources to spy on their spouse, something along those lines. Here you've got someone with lawful access to the system. They've got a right to be there, but they've exceeded that by sort of stepping outside of, what they should be using it for. Now, a lot of you will be aware that there was a Supreme Court case very recently. I think Tony Vellini here at DePaul did some writing on it. But the idea here was, if you've got a statute that says, it's a felony to exceed the scope of your authorization on a protected system, that's a hacking law, CFAA. Take the employee who's really supposed to be using their work computers for, work, but maybe on their lunch break they hit ESPN.com, right? And they're sort of checking the scores. Are they a felony hacker, right? Or is this really, maybe a little bit more de minimis? And so I'd encourage you all to do some reading on that. I don't want to get too bogged down in sort of the details of the case here, but just sort of be aware that, there are instances where you can have lawful access to a system. If you exceed the scope of that and create a CI or A issue, we're talking about a cybersecurity problem. The third, I think, is probably the most frustrating, but it's also probably the most common. And this is what I call the oops category of sort of cybersecurity incidents. In a lot of cases, companies will have what they call like a production database, right? The live server, the live version of a data set. And then you've got sort of a background or a test server or something like that, somewhere where you can sort of have a guardrails up place to work on your application or your database or whatever. Every so often, right, someone will, work in the live production database, right? Rather than sort of syncing every once in a while, they'll work on the live data set and they accidentally hit Control A and then backspace, right? And they've deleted everything. There is no undo button in like SQL, right? You've sort of accidentally just deleted everything. That happens all the time. And believe it or not, it is a cybersecurity issue, number one, but number two, it's a legal issue. Oftentimes in, like, for example, software as a service agreements, you'll see uptime requirements, right? You must be up 95% of the time, to be delivering on the contract. Other times you will see, requirements that data remain intact and retained for X number of years. Let's say we're talking about like a health system, right? And they're working on the live data set, and they accidentally sort of do that, right? They lose the hard drive. Oops, something happened. There are state medical record retention law requirements. And so to the extent that you've lost that data, you've now run afoul of those. And oftentimes those can be strict liability. In addition, on the state side, you also have like federal resources, right? There is no sort of specific document retention requirement under HIPAA, but you do see it in like finance regulation. There are the oops category. It's far and away the largest. It is something that is easy to plan around generally. I raise it here because, number one, it is the most common. But number two, I think there is sort of a perception that because it's an innocent mistake, there's no sort of fallout. There absolutely is. From an operational perspective, from a legal perspective, it's really sort of critical to be on top of. Maybe plan around. So I've got this idea up here of internal versus external threats. And I think the reason why I want to talk about it here is because when you're talking about cybersecurity, I think most people sort of jump to, the hackers, right? The Russian APT or whatever, talking about sort of hacking into your network remotely. You can have inside threats, right? And that can be something as simple as the employees leave the door open, right? It's irritating to badge back in, and so they leave the door back open, they tape the lock. Maybe they often leave their computers unlocked because it's kind of a pain to log back in every time. That's an internal cybersecurity threat. And so I think it's helpful to just sort of be aware of not only the distinction, but also just be cognizant of the fact that these are risks that you will have to manage as well. As lawyers, as we'll talk about a little bit later on, we are generally responsible for our direct reports. And so if, you work in a law firm, maybe you're running a small firm, something like that, your paralegal has a sort of cybersecurity issue. They blast out documents to the wrong place, whatever, they left it unlocked. That's an internal threat. So it is something, again, that we're going to want to think about, manage, identify those risks, and decide how we're going to handle them. On the external side of things, just some terminology here. So threat actor is generally sort of any sort of unknown third party, who is causing some kind of chaos or disruption here. Typically it's for financial gain, but not always, right? There's a sort of subcategory of threat actor that we call the hacktivist, right? Anonymous back in its earliest stages was more of a hacktivist group than anything else. And the idea here was that, that they're not hacking for money, they're not hacking for notoriety, it's really to get something done. Another sort of flavor that you see very often, again, very common, something called a script kiddie, This is typically someone who, sort of may not necessarily have a lot of expertise. They know enough to be dangerous usually. Typically, this is someone who will go online, go to GitHub, download a script. They may not necessarily understand everything that it does, but the instructions are pretty good on it, right? And so they run this script and it causes some chaos. Most malware is going to be sort of disseminated by script kiddies. So you might have something like, an initial access broker, maybe an APT, someone who's got a little bit more sophistication is sort of writing and distributing the malware to affiliates. And then you've got sort of script kiddies or affiliates who are pushing it out. They're the ones who are sort of handling the launching the ransomware in a lot of cases. And so it's helpful to sort of be cognizant of the fact that these exist. They're very common. And typically, it's usually like a teenager, right? It doesn't take a lot of know-how to get on GitHub, follow the instructions, and sort of do what the instructions tell you to do. And so we can see a lot of damage that sort of occurs from that flavor of hacker. Finally, we've got this hat system that I think it's sort of a fun way to differentiate between good guys and bad guys. So, the hacker that you think of in your 90s movies, right? That is your, we call them black hat. You're hacking for a malicious purpose. Your white hat hacker is typically someone who is hacking ethically. It's oftentimes people like security researchers who are sort of looking for vulnerabilities. They report them responsibly, not posting them on Reddit or something like that. But generally speaking, this is someone who's hacking for good. And then somewhere in the middle, you've got your gray hats, right? And these are people, maybe cybersecurity professionals by day, threat actors by night. Maybe they are someone who, in the course of reporting a bug or something like that, maybe they strongly suggest that if your payout to them is not sufficient, that it'll get posted somewhere else, right? It's not a bright line, but it is sort of it's lingo that you'll often hear used to describe the different sort of camps. When you have cybersecurity failing, right, I don't think any of this should be surprising to anybody, right? You've got a loss of privacy that happens. Theft of intellectual property. This comes up pretty often, particularly in like STEM fields, right? If you're working with like research teams or something like that. For those of you who are familiar with IP, trade secrets, right? A trade secret that is not secret is given very little legal protection, if any, right? And so the mere fact that your trade secret has been hacked and published, a lot of times that can lead to you losing that protection. And so a lot of what we're concerned about is, sort of the trade secret side of things. Espionage, right? Hacking for corporate gain, or at least I should say, sort of violations of CIA for corporate gain. Damage to physical property, right? I think, sort of the classic example that I think of is, sort of say a company makes some kind of always online speaker, something like that, right? It's got to be connected to the internet. And ultimately, when they discontinue the product line, they push an update that bricks the device, right? And so now your speaker is a paperweight. Sometimes that can be done, by the company themselves. Other times, though, a hacker might do it, right? And so we might see sort of damage to property. A lot of times when we see certain types of malware, particularly sort of close to the metal type code, they can cause real sort of physical damage, right? I think Mr. Robot has a great thing about like damaging UPS power supplies and blowing up buildings or something. Most common, debatably most important in the business context, loss of public confidence. When you've got something like this going on, it grabs headlines, right? If you've been hacked, it's very rare. It's very common that we're doing sort of crisis communication type work, interfacing with media. And, a great example of this is a company like LastPass, right? Personal user, big fan of password managers, but, as soon as a password manager has been hacked, that really is going to be very damaging to their market share in a lot of ways. And there are plenty of competition ready to sort of to jump on that. So the public confidence piece is key. Again, the Orrick law firm very recently, maybe in the last year or so, had a cybersecurity incident that was pretty public. A lot of clients were understandably very concerned. And not terribly, it's not like the door was open, right? You don't necessarily have to be horribly negligent to become a victim of this and to sort of see your company's name in the headlines. National security, again, this is something we deal with very, very often, defense contractors and things like that. Even sort of CUI, controlled and classified information, is something that is regulated. When that stuff is compromised, there's a national security concern. I can tell you from experience, if something like that happens, one of the first phone calls you'll get will be from like the Navy. And that's sort of a jarring call to receive. And then of course, economic damages, right? I mean, downtime alone is considerable. We've had clients that lose to the tune of, several $1 million for every day they're down. And restoration firms are saying it's going to be 3 months before we're back up. There are massive, massive economic damages here. So now getting kind of into, okay, we know there's a problem. We know sort of the lens that we're applying. We've even rambled about risk for a little bit. How do we sort of manage or mitigate some of these cybersecurity risks? Generally, we talk about 3 categories of controls, right? We've got physical controls. These are real world assets that mitigate risk to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This is everything from security guards, door locks, CCTV. I do have MFA on here, and I think, when we're talking about, we'll talk a little bit more about what factors mean in a minute, but something like door badges, right? This is something you have to get into the building. So we're talking about these security controls that protect CIA in the physical sense. Second category would be your technical controls. These are typically logical sort of pieces. So it could be code. Typically it's logical controls that are designed to mitigate against threats. So this could be something like antivirus, right? If you've all got Windows Defender installed, great. You've got technical security controls. This is fantastic. If you've got EDR, XDR, MDR, it's in order, endpoint detection and response, managed detection and response. These are all sort of phrases for the same idea. It's sort of antivirus on steroids. It's becoming more and more common and in some contexts required. Oftentimes as part of software as a service agreements, you will see requirements that you have an EDR, XDR, MDR. And so, of course, if we're running businesses, advising on businesses, helpful to sort of know what those are. These are technical controls that help sort of reduce risk. Firewalls, if you've ever logged onto a Wi-Fi network, you have at some level been exposed to a firewall. Again, you're filtering traffic based on the contents of the communications, or maybe just based on the origin of those communications. In either case, you're talking about sort of a technical control here. Again, I've listed MFA. Passwords. If you've ever used a password, you have used some kind of a technical control. Password is a factor. Again, we'll talk about that. But, again, all of these sort of controls are arrows in your quiver to mitigate risk. If you were to sort of take one slide from this presentation, arguably this would be the one to take away. Finally, administrative. These are policies, procedures, administrative things that help sort of boost confidentiality, integrity, availability. These are often products of statute or regulation, right? And so you may be required to have certain kinds of administrative controls in place depending on your industry vertical. Some states, we're now starting to see them pass laws that require certain kinds of administrative controls. But again, these are things like document retention policies, purging policies, right? Maybe it's not a good idea to hold on to someone's social security number in perpetuity forever, right? Maybe there's sort of a discrete use, and after that, we really don't have any use for it after the first 6 months. Maybe it should be purged, right? We can reduce risk in that way. If we go back to our slide about, the risk and sort of how bad something would be, I would much rather be dealing with a compromise that involves 200 social security numbers than 200,000, every time. Information governance plans. This is the idea that you are categorizing information based on the sensitivity. You know, the fact that my first name is Colin and my social security number, both pieces of personal information, but sort of different levels of severity, we should be classifying that data internally. Typically, this becomes a problem when we see someone who's got sort of a, you know, let's imagine a small, like 6-person law firm. You've got a folder structure that just says documents and everybody dumps everything there. All the crap lands there. That is a real cybersecurity risk. There's no sort of information governance. There's no sort of scalable protection. And so there's nothing that stops me from putting, you know, client records in the marketing folder. Right? And the marketing folder is public, anybody can access it. And so now maybe I've created an ethical issue as a lawyer. Business continuity, disaster recovery plans. This is, you know, what happens if something happens. You know, we talked about availability as a core component. If a meteor comes down and hits your data center, what does that do? Right? If it hits your file server, what happens? Maybe the answer is we're done. Maybe the answer is our, you know, our hot site backup, you know, 2 jurisdictions over, kicks in. That's all outlined in a business continuity or disaster recovery plan, technically distinct, but you'll often see them lumped together. I mentioned we would get back to authentication and specifically factors. So authentication is this idea of, you know, sort of verifying that you are who you say you are. That shouldn't be surprising to anybody. Single factor versus multi-factor authentication. I'm going to ask the room to chime in on a low-hanging fruit here. Which is better, single factor or multi-factor? Yeah.
Multi-factor.
Multi-factor. Okay, good. That's correct. What are we talking about when we're talking about factors? Well, so let me give you an example. Let's say you go to log into your email account, right? And you've got to punch in your username and your password, right? And that requires that you know the password in order to be able to authenticate in, right? But what happens if there's a security question that says, you know, what's the name of your first pet, right? You've now got to answer a second question, but that's still contingent on you, it's something you know, right? In both cases, it's something you know. And so even though there's 2 questions, we would still call that single factor. The factor is something you know. There are 3 factors generally that we talk about. The first, something you know. Second, something you are. It's biometrics. It's your face ID. It's your fingerprint, right? If you have to log into your email and, you know, use your face ID before you can open up the email app on your phone, great. Now we're talking about 2 factors. It's something you are and something you know, assuming you have to provide the password when you open the app. The last one is something you have. More and more, we're seeing hardware keys. So something like a YubiKey, right? This is a USB, like a flash drive size device. You have to have this device plugged into your computer to be able to open the computer, even if you know the password. So, you know, if you're talking about something like multi-factor, you want at least 2, right? Ideally 3. Not everyone will do 3, but at least 2 is what we mean by multi-factor authentication. The other piece to be cognizant of, and again, I think I'll ask for some participation from the room here. If you have to walk through this with me to open up your email on your phone, you're waiting for the professor to send out the reading for that night. First thing you do, you unlock the phone with Face ID. Then you've got to open up the email app, and then you've got to type in a password. Then you've got to run over to the next room over, grab your YubiKey, plug it into your phone, right? Then you've got to do a fingerprint scan. That's going to send you a text message, but not to this phone. It's going to go to your other backup phone, right? And you're going to run over, you're going to get that message, you're going to plug it in. You verified with something you have with the other phone. You verified something you have with the YubiKey. You've used Face ID to get into the phone. You've typed in the password. It's been 25 minutes and you haven't logged into the email yet. Show of hands, who would be happy to do this type of authentication every time? Great. Nobody has their hands up. And that is accurate, right? So does that mean that that set of security controls is bad? Yes, right? If people bypass those controls, right, they turn them all off because they're irritating to use. you have sacrificed too much in the way of convenience in the name of security. And so as cybersecurity professionals, one of the things that we're always sort of thinking about in the background here is this spectrum, right? You've got convenience over here, security over here. If you sway too far this direction, you're too secure, you've got 25 different factors to log into your email, that's not helpful. People are going to turn that off. If you're way over here, right, and you're talking about no password, right? It's just sitting open at all times. Anybody who walks up can just open up your email. That's also bad. The answer is you need to sort of be somewhere in between, and that's got to be made on a sort of case-by-case basis. If we're talking about HR records, right, employee social security numbers, if we're talking about trade secret data, we should be way over here, right? I love to picture the Coca-Cola's big vault, right, where they keep the secret formula, the secret recipe. That's way over here, right? Because it's okay that that's not terribly convenient. It shouldn't be. If we're talking about the ability to quickly open up your phone to respond to a text, maybe it's okay that it's only single factor, right? We're just doing Face ID, and maybe that's okay. So in all cases, we want to be thinking about security versus convenience. And so it's easy to sort of go overboard on multi-factor, which is why I include it here. So keep that in mind as you're counseling your clients. So earlier, I put up, all these different things. We talked a little bit about things that can go wrong with cybersecurity, right? We've talked about ransomware. We talked about, business email compromise, things that can happen. I think it's, as I mentioned, it's not terribly helpful for me to stand up here and say AES 256 as opposed to SHA-12, right? Maybe those are, different, but ultimately that's not something we need to be too terribly concerned with as lawyers. This slide is really meant to give you sort of a sense of value-oriented risk mitigation ideas, right? Quick tangent, value is bolded here. I did not say cheap. I said value, right? There's a big difference between cost and value. We want to make sure that we're delivering the most value to our clients. If I've got a client who's looking to open up their first pizza shop, right? They're doing a small, sort of opening a family restaurant type thing. Does it make sense for me to pitch them a $10 million cybersecurity appliance? Not at all, right? They're worried more about the pepperoni. We want to make sure that things scale and fit with the organization. If I'm helping a defense contractor get set up, a $10 million cybersecurity plan, it might make sense, right? But we want to be sort of thoughtful about that, which is why I've highlighted value as a key idea here. I borrowed the dollar signs from Yelp, Apple, whatever you want to call it. These are sort of costs associated with the implementation of these specific things. Patching schedules, right? A lot of people do patch Tuesdays, right? Your software being out of date is a huge sort of risk. It's not terribly complicated to have something like this in place, worth doing. Information governance plans, we talked about this. The employee record should not be in the marketing folder, right? We want to make sure that things are sort of distinguished. We want to make sure that the janitor does not have access to all the PHI in the hospital. And so, information governance is sort of core to that. Another thought here, we could get aligned with the standard, right? If we've got a client, maybe a sort of software, maybe someone's launching a website or an app or something like that. Maybe we look to a pre-existing security framework, something that already exists, and say, well, we are going to sort of model ourselves after this and maybe even go get a certificate of compliance. I have an asterisk here because a lot of people, a lot of my clients, kind of come to me with the perception that I'm NIST 800 compliant, right? That means I don't have to do anything else and I'm golden. These compliance frameworks are often made to be scalable, right? And so they'll say things like must use reasonable security, reasonable precautions, right? Alignment with the standard in and of itself is never going to be sufficient. So, keep an eye out for that. Certainly if you're in a transactional context, you will have sort of vendors who say, we're SOC 2 compliant, and so there's nothing to worry about ever. That's not true, but maybe it's something worth pushing back on in the context of like a transaction. Business continuity, disaster recovery plans. We talked about this, knowing what happens when something happens. We want to make sure that we are prepared. If we have uptime requirements, we're aware of those. what happens if, right, a meteor hits the server room? We want to be aware of that. What happens if we get hit with a DOS attack? We should probably have some kind of proxy servers, at least know where we would get those. Incident response planning, tabletop exercises. These are mock sort of incidents that a lot of times firms will do for free. Cyber insurance carriers oftentimes will do them at either low or no cost. Because if you've gone through these, the severity of an incident is going to be significantly lower. And so, because they're so freely available, take advantage. Absolutely take advantage. Appropriate insurance. This can be pricey depending on your vertical. I can tell you if you're operating in the healthcare space, it's going to be very expensive. That doesn't mean it's not appropriate, but it may cost some money to do that. It may make sense, but again, we're thinking through. Again, a lot of brokers will do that kind of thing for either low or no cost. They'll evaluate your existing coverage and tell you, look, the median sort of ransomware claim right now is running about, say $400,000 on the response side. And if you have to pay the ransom, median ransom payment right now is about $800,000. So your cyber insurance policy for $5,000 may not be terribly adequate here. But again, maybe if you're a pizza shop, and you've got sort of no digital assets, you're a cash business, it doesn't matter all that much. But again, this is something to be talking through. Penetration testing. This is what I would equate to going to your PCP, going to your doctor for a checkup. A penetration test is when you hire a white hat hacker, typically they'll call them the red team security assessment. This is someone who will test your systems from varying levels, typically from an external outside the network. They'll see what they can do. If they can break your website in 10 seconds, there's an issue. Particularly if you're, say, something like a software company. Maybe you are vulnerable. Yeah.
Oh, we have 5 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay, thanks. Maybe you are vulnerable to something like SQL injection, and with one command from a user, unauthenticated, they can wipe your whole database. The self-retweeting tweet a couple of years back, similar idea. Penetration testing, great call, third-party audit. Again, having someone come in, as lawyers, our ethical obligation is not to understand every piece of the tech, it is to do an analysis of it. And oftentimes that involves bringing in a third party. I do have some examples here. Maybe this would be sort of an organic sort of point. We'll sort of, the ethics rules are in the presentation. Feel free to browse those at your leisure. I'd like to get your thoughts on how you might mitigate some of these risks. Can I ask for someone in the back over here, maybe, how would you handle something like paper records? You've got a shared office environment, maybe a doctor's office. If you're a cybersecurity professional, what kinds of things are you thinking about to mitigate risk there? Anyone in the back over there, maybe?
Like how long you hold on to the paper? Do you just run it at some point?
Sure, yeah, maybe just stacks of paper being left out. Is there any issue with that from like a confidentiality perspective, maybe?
Just pick it up then.
Yeah, so what might you recommend?
Secure filing or something.
Great, yeah, like a physical sort of box that the papers go in when we're not using them. As a law firm, I think this one's probably, yeah.
No, I was gonna say you could scan the document and put it on a backup drive.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe we just don't need to have the physical paper records in the first place. Maybe a document retention or purging policy would make a lot more sense there for the paper records. One of the most common sort of schemes that we're seeing hit lawyers is the misdirected wire. This is typically a bad guy who breaks into a lawyer's email account, looks for large sums of money, and sort of chooses a strategic point to stand up an alternate email account, provide new wiring instructions, that money is sent elsewhere. More than half the time, those funds are not recoverable. So let's say you are doing an escrow for your client on a real estate transaction involving, say, $5 million in commercial property. If you are the lawyer, your password was password one, someone has now misdirected that $5 million, you've got an issue, right? And so if I tell you that the email was the threat vector, what ideas do we have about how we can sort of lock that down? How can we sort of bolster CIA there? Maybe like factors, right? Multi-factor authentication on the email accounts. These are all things that we can do. This is the lens that we should be applying as cybersecurity professionals, but also as lawyers. And again, to reiterate, this is not just a technician's problem. This is not the IT guy's issue. This is business risk from the bottom all the way to the top. At the C-suite level, cybersecurity is a major talking point. As lawyers, at a minimum, we should be equipped to understand it. And arguably, I think for us to be doing our jobs for corporate clients, certainly, we need to have a good sense of how this stuff works. What are the risks? If I tell you that we leave all the paper records on the counter at the doctor's office, is that okay? Something in the back of your head as the lawyer should say, maybe not. I think, do see a question here before we wrap. Oh, sorry, Brett, I've lost it.
Very good. Can you have a retention policy that differs from statute to better protect clients?
Yes, absolutely. There is risk associated with holding documents longer than needed, right? The example, if I'd rather deal with 200 social security numbers than 200,000, but yes, statute is the minimum. You can certainly exceed that where it makes sense. I think that might be an organic stopping point, but if anybody has any questions, happy to address. Yeah.
What would be the best way to deal with a ransomware attack?
In the context of a ransomware attack, the house is on fire. Your first call should be the fire department, right? My recommendation is typically do not engage threat actors. When you do, that typically starts a clock, at which point pressure will start to be applied. To the extent you can, you want to stop the spread of the fire, right? Unplug that server, unplug the computers. You want to contain the ransomware as much as possible. 3, do not try to recover data. Encryption is it's a math problem, right? And the secret value X is only known to the threat actor. If you manipulate the underlying data such that X is no longer the common factor, it will not decrypt the data. Your files will be corrupted. The most important thing you can do is right away loop in help. Don't wing it. Don't call the IT guy, who's a one-man shop. Sometimes they know what they're doing. Sometimes they don't. There are professionals that do this kind of work every day, digital forensics teams, threat intelligence teams. That's who you should be calling when the house is on fire. The worst thing you can do is wait and see or try to wing it. So.
Right. Any other questions in the room or?
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
the worst thing that been happening to me is you get into a site and it says, you gotta show you're not a robot. And then it says pick 2 objects, and you pick 2 and then it's not good. And you keep going in circles and circles. It just never stops.
Yeah, so that's called the Turing test, CAPTCHA, completely automated. It's a way to differentiate human traffic between robots. The computation that happens behind those is fascinating. Oftentimes they're looking at things like mouse movements to determine whether it looks more like a computer or a PC. But yes, take your point. Those can be frustrating when you're trying to get something done. I think there may have been one over here.
Yeah, I agree with you when you said that there's a concerted effort to make sure that the factor authentication is not like superseding convenience in a way that would make it not useful at all.
Mm-hmm.
One of the bigger issues that I feel like I run into is wanting to keep my personal electronics and my personal data separate from work or university or anything like that. And I do feel like the stepped authentications kind of force a merge between those 2 things. Are there any efforts being made to try to allow people to maintain a private life and a business life while still engaging in these authenticators?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the key issue when you're talking about sort of sharing data between profiles is the something you know factor, right? The street you grew up on is the same, irrespective of whether it's a corporate or personal account. Other factors are a little bit more agnostic to that, right? So, hardware keys, right? I mean, that's just a key with the answer to a math problem on it. So something like a YubiKey is a great way to do that. Maybe you've got one for work devices, one for home. Another thought is data segmentation, right? The work data should generally not leave the workplace unless there's some compelling need. Typically firms will issue you laptops that are not necessarily processing locally, but it's actually just an instance of their server environment. So it is one and the same. So there are sort of, it's really more of an implementation thing than, sort of an underlying technology issue. But absolutely, right, you're asking the right question. That is something that you should be focused on. And there's sort of ways that you can get a little creative about doing that. A lot of it is conversation. People don't realize there's an issue. It's hard to sort of address an issue. So,
Thank you.
yeah, of course.